This is Lesson 21 for Reforms and Revolutions before 1848. And keep in mind, why before 1848? That seems kind of weird. 1848 is a banner year for revolutions, but there was a lot going on that led up to that. So the question is, how and where was conservatism challenged after 1815? College Board Topic 6.6, Revolutions and Reactions. Explain how and why various groups reacted against the existing order from 1815 to 1914. In the first half of the 19th century, revolutionaries attempted to destroy the status quo. Place: Greece, Great Britain, Ireland, and France. Key concepts of reforms and revolutions before 1848. You had the Corn Laws, the Battle of Peterloo, the Reform Bill of 1832, the Six Acts of 1819, and this thing called rotten boroughs. Key people of reforms and revolutions before 1848: Charles X, the Chartists, Lord Robert Peel, Louis XVIII, and Louis Philippe. What we've seen so far: the Congress of Vienna established conservatism as the clear winner in 1815. The landed aristocracy and autocratic government hold power. Conservatives are willing to go to great lengths to protect the Congress system. Metternich and the Holy Alliance have shown that they are willing to fight for this system. Liberalism, nationalism, and socialism, and many other isms are rising up to challenge conservatism. Where will more serious challenges occur? Which ism will win? Greece in the 1820s. Greece had been under the control of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. The Greek people had managed to keep their identity, their Greek language, their Eastern Orthodox religion. But in 1821, revolt broke out. Their leader was Alexander Ypsilanti. He was a general in the Russian army. That's going to be significant. Clemens von Metternich was going to ignore the Greek cause. The Ottomans in Greece were preserving the balance of power with the Russians, and that was good for Metternich. The balance of power was of far greater concern to Metternich than the aspirations of these Greek nationalists. Russia and Greece were both Eastern Orthodox countries. He didn't want Russia in Greece. However, homegrown support for the Greeks was overwhelming, and it came from all over Europe. Romantic poet Lord Byron even went there to fight for Greece. This was something that hadn't gone into Metternich's calculations when he was acting as architect of the Concert of Europe via the Congress of Vienna. That popular will might dictate international policy? No way. What else might Metternich and the Congress of Vienna not have thought of? Britain, France, and Russia had to demand that the Ottomans accept an armistice, but the Ottomans refused. So the navies of all three of these countries trapped the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Navarino. Russia then fought a war of expansion against the Ottomans. Russia took Romania and got to keep it. And Greece was declared independent in 1830. Russia, France, and Great Britain installed a Bavarian prince, Otto, as the King of Greece in 1832. Great Britain and reform. The landed aristocracy had all the power. Government policies tended to support the landed aristocracy. About 8% of the male population could vote. Many people were already interested in reform. In 1815, the landed aristocracy pushed the Corn Laws through Parliament. The word corn referred to really any kind of grain. For example, wheat. The landed aristocracy controlled the grain production in Europe, and the Corn Laws raised import tariffs on grain so high that cheap grain from elsewhere could not be imported into Britain. This made food prices unaffordably high for most working-class people. It was great for the landed aristocracy. The food was grown on their land, which was why the landed aristocracy had pushed the Corn Laws through in the first place. This was also a time of widespread unemployment. But this was about much more than just the price of grain. The real issue was this: if a class of people has the power to perpetuate such hardship on the rest of us, the working class that has to buy food, the wealthy industrial middle class that has to pay their workers enough to buy food, If they can do this for blatantly selfish reasons with total impunity, don't they have way too much political power? Urban laborers began holding protests and demonstrations against the Corn Laws. They also had the support of radical intellectuals. The Tory government, and that was a government totally controlled by the landed aristocracy, started taking away traditional rights from people as punishment. For example, the right to assembly, the right of habeas corpus, the right to a trial. Parliament passed the Six Acts, which brought heavy individual restrictions. This all culminated in the Battle of Peterloo. In Manchester, there was a huge protest against the Six Acts. There were 60 to 80,000 people there. They were at St. Peter's Fields, and armed cavalry attacked the protesters. The casualties were about 15 people killed and 400 to 700 injured. Where were the wealthy commercial and manufacturing interests during this controversy? They had started pushing for participation in the government. Shouldn't their financial power entitle them to a share of political power and prestige? They called for more liberal reform, improved town government, better police, more rights for Catholics, reform of the poor laws, economic liberalism, and to stop restricting imports of grain. In other words, a stop to the Corn Laws. But the biggest, most sweeping challenge of all actually came directly to Parliament itself, and it was this. The Whig Party and the Tory Party both consisted of elite aristocrats. But the Whig Party was traditionally more sympathetic to commercial and manufacturing interests. In 1830, the Whig Party introduced a bill into Parliament, quote, to amend representation. In other words, to alter the representational composition of the entire Parliament. And this was the Reform Bill of 1832. And you might say that this is the Whig Party being nice, wanting to be more democratic, but in reality, the Reform Bill of 1832 was actually about heading off major class conflict that they could see coming. This is an interesting picture because you see the factions represented. You see the Whig Party, the Tories, the Liberals, and the Radicals. And they all have something to say about reform. The Whig Party says reform is absolutely necessary to prevent revolution. The Tory Party says, I do maintain that reform means nothing else than revolution. The Liberal says a little reform is wanting, but fiddle-dee-dee about revolution. And in this context, the word wanting means it's wanted, it's lacking, it needs to happen. And then finally, the Radical says, I say if we don't have a real radical reform, we'll have a revolution. The Reform Bill of 1832, more democratic results. The House of Commons, because of the Reform Bill of 1832, became more powerful than the House of Lords. The new industrial areas that were growing so quickly finally got proper representation. For example, the city of Manchester. And the so-called rotten boroughs were eliminated. Rotten boroughs with names like Old Sarum and Gatton, for example. The percentage of voters increased from about 8% of adult men to about 15% of adult men. So still not very much democracy there. So what was a rotten borough? Well, a borough was a district. It got representation in Parliament like a congressional district gets representation in our Congress. But as we've learned, industrialization and the enclosure movement were causing mass migration from the country to the cities. But there was no mechanism in Parliament to make adjustments to these massive shifts in population. Hence, many boroughs had become, quote, rotten through depopulation. For example, you've got a painting right here of Old Sarum. The rotten borough of Old Sarum, depicted below, had a total of 3 houses, 7 qualified voters, and a whopping three members of Parliament, MPs, representing it. Meanwhile, the exploding industrial cities of Manchester and Birmingham had no MPs representing their interests in Parliament. This is a very interesting picture of the Reform Mill. It's a depiction of the Reform Bill. And you've got Tories, you've got Whigs, you've got farmers, you've got workers, and they're all stuffing these rotten boroughs into the Reform Mill. And of course, what comes out? A stronger, happier Britain. The Chartist Movement. In 1837, a committee of 6 Parliament members and 6 working men published a work called the People's Charter of 1838. It defined the direction that they thought the British government should go, and on top of that list was universal male suffrage, secret ballot, and no property requirement for running for the House of Commons. Hence, the Chartist movement formed. The Chartists saw this charter as the key to more radical reform, complete democracy, rule by the common people, and massive petitions were signed demanding that Parliament institute the People's Charter. It went up in 1839, it was rejected. It went up again in 1842, it was rejected. It went up a third time in 1848, and it was rejected. But there was a result to the Chartist movement. The working class had now teamed up with the middle class manufacturers for change, and together they formed the Anti-Corn Law League in 1839. And they argued together that repeal of the corn laws would result in, number one, lower food prices, and number two, more jobs in industry. And then in the year 1845, Ireland's potato crop failed. Everyone knew that the price of grain was about to skyrocket. So Prime Minister Lord Robert Peel got the corn laws repealed in 1846. It wasn't easy. The Whigs were all for the repeal of the corn laws, but the Tories were totally against it. Peel himself was a Tory, so he had to go against his own party. And only a small minority of Tories would go along with this repeal. But from that point on, once this was repealed, free trade became a sacred dogma in Great Britain. The 10 Hours Act of 1847. This bill got passed in an unprecedented way. The working class was becoming a powerful political force at this time, and they supported the middle class. Remember, the working class and the middle class had gotten together on the People's Charter of 1838. The Tories wanted some of that working class support for themselves. They saw themselves as competing with the middle class. So they were actually the ones who passed the 10 Hours Act. And the 10 Hours Act of 1847 limited the workday for women and young people. Ireland and this Great Famine. Ireland lived in extreme poverty, and it was an agricultural country, and it was almost completely Catholic. The Irish rented their land, and their landlords were typically Church of England. Landlords typically even lived in England, and they set the rental rates any way they wanted to, and they evicted people who couldn't pay at will. Irish farmers lived almost entirely on potatoes, and the Great Famine was an absolute calamity. Up to 1.5 million died, and another million left the country. Ireland was the only country in Europe with a declining population during this time, and the British government was extremely slow to respond to the crisis. They continued to collect taxes, and landowners still demanded rent. So what were the long-term results of the Great Famine? Lots of anti-British feeling. Lots of anti-Protestant feeling, Irish nationalism, and calls for land reform, for home rule, for Irish independence. The Revolution of 1830 in France. Remember that in France you had the Bourbon Restoration of 1814 with the crowning of Louis XVIII by the Congress of Vienna, which we previously talked about. Metternich and his people would have loved to have restored autocratic absolute monarchy to France. Metternich, as we know, was not a fan at all of constitutions, but Metternich was willing to accept political realities when it came to France. There was simply no way you were going to turn back the clock 25 years. So for France, Metternich had been willing to make an exception. Louis XVIII granted a constitutional charter, the Charter of 1814, and it specified the protection of the economic and social gains made by the middle class and by the peasantry during the French Revolution, and permission of some artistic and intellectual freedom in France, and the creation of a parliament with an upper house and a lower house, in other words, a bicameral parliament. About 100,000 men out of a country of about 30 million were allowed to vote, and these voters were the wealthiest. They were also a mixed bag of notables, a mixture of old aristocracy, wealthy business people, professionals, ex-revolutionaries, Bourbons, and Bonapartists. Some die-hard aristocrats tried to sweep away all the revolutionary changes and make Louis the absolute monarch. But Louis XVIII refused to do that, and he appointed moderate royalists in his government. They worked with the Parliament, not against the Parliament. And this worked fine until Louis XVIII died in the year 1824. And then this guy shows up, Charles X. Charles X was actually the youngest brother of Louis XVI and Louis XVIII. During the French Revolution, he had been an exiled émigré leader. He was an ultra-royalist, a true reactionary, an extreme conservative. And after the restoration of his brother to the throne, he had actually been his brother Louis XVIII's head of secret police. He wanted to turn the clock all the way back to the old regime. But Parliament blocked all of his ultra-royalist policies. But he had a plan to thwart Parliament. In June 1830, Charles X figured he would rally the people of France by conquering Algeria. Algeria was an Ottoman vassal state. Charles sent 37,000 troops there, and the war went great for a short while. Charles X began to believe that he had the support of the people because of his success in this war. So, in July 1830, Charles X repudiated the Constitutional Charter of 1814. He censored the press, he stripped the wealthy middle class of their voting rights, and because of all that, there were 3 days of vicious rioting in the streets of Paris. And Charles X finally had to flee the country, and he abdicated. The upper middle class took over just long enough to put Charles X's cousin, French Revolutionary War hero Louis Philippe, Duke of Orleans, on the throne. And Louis Philippe accepted the Charter of 1814, which Charles X had just tried to repudiate. But that was as far as he was willing to go with reform. So Louis Philippe managed to stop the clock until 1848. So what were the results of all this for the rest of Europe? Well, number one, you had the rebirth of French colonial expansion. The war in Algeria lasted all the way until 1847. The French encouraged immigration to Algeria from all over southern Europe. Revolts like this one in Paris happened all over Europe in 1830. Belgian Catholics revolted against their Dutch king and established the Kingdom of Belgium. And this was the only other successful revolution of 1830. So the only 2 successful ones were in France and in Belgium. In Switzerland, constitutional crises in all the various cantons occurred between liberals and conservatives. Polish nationalists revolted against Russia and were brutally crushed. This is called the November Uprising, or the Polish-Russian War, or the Cadet Revolution of 1830 to 1831.